አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምብኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ። አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምብኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Salam everyone, welcome to Adebabay Media. This is we are here to discuss today what's going on in Ethiopia, the current developments as far as the Amhara movement and what that means. My guest today is Dr. Adebabay. We will try to cover a very complicated issue and try to simplify it a bit so we can understand what's going on. Until then, please go ahead and share this conversation with your friends and loved ones, and we'll be right back.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት
Welcome back, everyone. I will be your host. My name is Adebabay. Just kind of give a general understanding or perspective of where we're going to come from as far as today's conversation. As we follow the development in Ethiopia, we see two different perspectives emerging. One would be the federal government stating that there's a coup attempt against it, and another would be a group of rebels positioning themselves and trying to explain that government has made it impossible for them to live and coexist in Ethiopia, which amounts to a state-sponsored genocide. To be able to understand this, there's a multitude of historical perspectives and ideological differences, which make this already complicated issue very complex, and the viewpoints could shift from the government to the individual, and depending on who you talk to, there's a vast way or vast different ways of looking at this. Today our task will be trying to try to give a different insight into what's going on in Ethiopia, trying to unravel some of this chaos and try to give a viewpoint towards a lasting peace in Ethiopia. My guest today, like I said, is Dr. Adebabay. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. It's been a minute. Welcome. I guess welcome back to the English program.
Indeed. Thank you.
To start our conversation, really, right now, the way we're looking at when we're looking at the Ethiopian political climate is that the Amhara people are being picked at or seen as an example of the state enemy. How did we come to that understanding, or where is that narrative coming from?
That's a good question. I just would like to begin by just giving what we call in social science and research a positionality of the speaker. I am a human rights researcher. I do research on issues related to what we are discussing today. I am a senior lecturer and researcher at Curtin University in Australia. So when I speak, I'm conscious of my positionality, which means I'm conscious of from whose perspective I am speaking. As a researcher and a scholar, I speak for, I don't condone violence. I'm not speaking on behalf of any group. I'm speaking, representing myself. I don't belong to any political entity. That means my views are based on the position of people who have no power from a human rights perspective, from the perspective of justice. So when we speak from human beings perspective, from justice perspective, from human rights perspective, what we see in Ethiopia is not ideological conflict. It is not about taking arms against a government to overthrow it. What we see in Ethiopia is the dehumanization of innocent people, a continuous murdering and killing of children, women, often in a very dehumanizing way, burning them alive, cutting pregnant women's belly open, and exterminating entire villages as an entire ethnic cleansing, a very shocking human rights violation and abuse. And what I'm trying to do here is to really show how did it happen? Why is it happening this way? And people still debate about politics, about government, because from what position do they see this violence is very important. So I want to give some historical context and clarification of the reasons why we fail to stand for people who are being murdered. Millions displaced from their homes and left on the streets. We fail to see why a government go out and destroys its own people, villagers, and we are just standing on the side and contemplating and trying to understand it. Because if we stand from the position of victims and people, it wouldn't take us a minute to stand with them. And I'm trying to uncover the reasons why we are unable to do that.
That's very interesting, because the main thing, like you said, what we're forgetting is people are dying, and it's becoming political to say people should not die. I think we're not even able to agree on that basic fact of citizens should be able to live in their own land without the fear of being killed. And that is becoming a very controversial idea. And like you said, it's become so political to a point where we can't say that without adding a but, or this is happening because, kind of explaining away citizens' right to live and not to live within their own land.
That is absolutely correct. And there is a reason behind it. The reason is that the political system in Ethiopia has dehumanized the Amhara people by making their identity as a crime. So, you know, in Ethiopia, when you think about it, it is not complicated to just say that people should not be killed. Why do we allow Amhara people with the identity of Amhara, who are poor farmers in particular, be murdered brutally? Because the system we live in has made their identity a controversial identity. In the same way, the identity of the Jews under the Nazis was seen as a controversial identity, so that ordinary people can stand aside and simply watch these innocent people being murdered. In the case of Rwanda as well, the Tutsis were murdered and killed, and the violence happened across many years. And people were on the side saying, oh, it is a complicated issue. And they say that because when the Belgians were in Rwanda, the Tutsis have had some relationship with the Belgian colonial administration in the past. But the Belgian administration ended, and Rwanda became under the control of Hutu nationalism. And the Hutu nationalism demonized the Tutsis. And because of that politics of demonizing Tutsi identities, people always say, oh, this issue is complicated. They see people discriminated, being killed, and until the last moment when the genocide happened openly, no one was really trying to understand what was happening. So what is happening in Ethiopia is the same thing. People are thinking about oh, the issue in Ethiopia is complicated. People who see this are people who are either cowards, they just don't want to face what it takes to stand for innocent people, or people who view politics through the eyes of power, through the eyes of those who are, presenting the narrative and the ideology. If we are human, if we really want to stand for those who are being prosecuted, we can see what is happening and speak from the perspective of those who are being harmed. And the reason why we feel this is complicated is because we are victims of the ideology that demonizes the Amhara people. And I'm happy to give some historical context for that.
Yes, please. The historical and the political perspective as to how we got to a point where we look at Amhara people not only as people, but as political entity as well, to kind of sacrifice and play the power game for the government to be able to stay in power and not stay in power, and give it a reason for the enemy to exist, right? Like just creating this idea of enemy. And as long as there's an enemy, right, there's a need for the powerful to continue to be powerful. So how did we make the Amhara as a sacrificial lamb of the powerful staying in power?
That is a very good question. And we really have to look back and see the role of ideology in politics, right? You remember we have had a discussion about native colonialism and how Ethiopians imported foreign ideas to reinvent the country as a new entity different from its past. It's very much connected to that. Ethiopians lived together for many, many years. And the world really appreciated Ethiopia. There were scholars even in the past telling Europeans to treat each other the way Ethiopians treat each other. What they mean by that is in Europe, Muslims were not allowed to live with Christians. Jews were not free. There was a conflict on the basis of identity and religious differences. And people were saying, look at Ethiopians. Ethiopians are living together. When the Muslims were prosecuted and were sent by their prophet to Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Christian king accepted them, protected them. When the Jews were living in Ethiopia for many, many, many years along Christianity, the Jews were never seen as enemies of the Ethiopian Christian empire. So what we saw in Ethiopia was an ideology, a monarchical ideology, not based on ethnicism, not based on religious difference, but based on this belief that the kings are anointed by God to rule over the entire country and people. And that Ethiopian perspective of rule by the king is different from the perspective that we find in Europe. In Europe, the king often divides the people on the basis of religion as a Catholic or as a Protestant, and there was conflict on the basis of that. But within Ethiopia, the emperors saw themselves as creating bridges across differences in ethnicity or tribe and religion. Because of that, they were allowing their family to be mixed with different ethnic groups. The Amharas were mixing with the Oromos, and they were mixing with the Tigrians. So you find kings coming from different ethnic groups, ruling the country based on the belief that the emperor is anointed by God to protect all of us. And that is what has played out in the Battle of Adwa, is that belief. When most African countries were conquered by Europeans, Ethiopians used this tradition of coming together, this kind of unconscious pluralism, a pluralism that recognizes the significance of difference. They come together without a standing army, traveling for more than 100 days on foot, went to Adwa and fought a modern Italian army, and they defeated that. That significant achievement is a testament to the existence of diversity within Ethiopia. Without a standing army, based on an indigenous philosophy that brought everyone together, Ethiopia has remained independent, the only independent country in Africa. Now, you see, that is the old monarchical ideology of power that we had in Ethiopia. But in 1974, after the 1960s, where students started to to accept these Marxist-Leninist ideologies and Western ideologies, 1974, the emperor was removed. After 1974, these young Ethiopians who no longer believe in the traditional indigenous philosophy of power, they brought in Western philosophy of power. And they were saying, how do we build a new Ethiopia? And that question is called a question of nation building. And there were basically two proposals. One proposal says, look, we have to remove any ethnic or cultural differences, the way the Europeans dealt with differences through repression and power politics. We have to get rid of this ethnicism of Oromo or Tigrinya or any cultural differences and create a one unified republic. And that should be our approach. So this group are called the unionist approach, or the Ethiopia One, Ethiopia only approach. This is not an Amhara approach. This is not any cultural group's approach. This is the approach of a group of elites who wanted to create a Western-styled republic in Ethiopia. A Western-styled republic, in a sense, a republic, a kind of political system that views cultural difference with suspicion culturally. And the second aspect is an aspect which says, no, we should actually go for ethnocentric nationalism, which means every tribe and ethnic group in Ethiopia should be sovereign. We have to allow them to have a sovereign national identity and create a new Ethiopia on the basis of the consent of these nations. Now, these two competing ideas are elite ideas. And the first idea became popular or dominant at the beginning. It influenced the military, and it became the ideology of the country for 17 years. Here what? At that time, what happened in Ethiopia is very important, and everyone should understand this. The Derg period for 17 years eliminated, killed the indigenous elders, the leaders of Ethiopia, and they took all their land. They declared what is called the land to the tiller. So the economic base, the political power base of the monarchical system was completely destroyed. Now, whether the monarchical system was Amhara or Oromo or Tigray or mixed, whatever it was, it is political system, it is power system, it is land, it is resources. Everything was destroyed through the nationalism of the Derg, because to destroy that enemy was what was fueled the revolutionary identity of the Derg era. Now, after 17 years, Ethiopians had enough of the Derg and replaced it with a new system led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF. And the TPLF articulated its agenda by saying that the Amhara ethnic group, or the Amhara ethnic group, was from where the leaders of Ethiopia came from, and the Amhara were the enemy of the sovereignty of nations and nationalities. That is what the discussion when the constitution came out shows. So this different ethnic group, in order to cultivate their nationalism, had to identify a national enemy. And that national enemy was regarded as Amhara. And the Amhara became a national enemy on the basis of the constitution, which is created after 1991. And in fact, in 1995, when the constitution came out, it was clear that it was there to give sovereign rights for all ethnic groups, but to also recreate the Amhara region, or the Amhara, as an entity that accepts this thesis, which say that the Amhara were the dominant feudal or colonial leaders of the past. So this is a historical background. The Amhara as invented as a crime, as an oppressor, through a political ideology that tries to create a new Ethiopia, a new nation building agenda. And the problem with this is that this label of Amhara become so difficult for ordinary Amharas to accept, Because of that, they are unable to organize themselves and fight back.
Yeah. So just to kind of ask a question on this. So the first ideology being, only Ethiopia and counting, I guess, the diversity or the differences amongst us as the enemy to be destroyed, right? And then the second ideology saying the problem of Ethiopia is the Amhara people and creating that ideology of the enemy. Can we state build, I guess, without an enemy being present? Or is that a purely Western idea that we try to import?
You see, that is a problem. That's a very good question. We can and we could. Every country creates their political system based on the context, based on how their people live. I think Ethiopia is possibly the only country that created its nation-building agenda by demonizing its own past. Of course, we can understand when we look at people who were colonized, they have reasons to be angry about the past, or to express that they were suppressed. So they say our past was bad because we are colonized. Yeah. Ethiopians who fought and remained independent, these Ethiopians just accepted the ideology which projected the past as evil and bad. Yeah. If you go to Europe, Europeans, where they adopted in secular politics or democracy, they had reasons to be secular. They had reasons to avoid some aspect of their culture, because in their past, in their culture, as I said earlier, there was genocide, there was war. In Britain, for instance, in Protestant Britain in the past, if you are a Catholic priest, you could be killed. You are not allowed to preach your religion unless you are an Anglican, unless you are a Protestant in Britain. And there was, for 30 years, there was this religious wars happening there until they resolved it through the Westphalia Treaty. And if you go back even in history where nationalism in Europe emerged, they created this idea of nationalism, which invented an external enemy within in order to mobilize their own people along their own agendas. You can refer to the Crusade, where the Europeans were mobilized to fight against the Jews, or against the Muslims overseas. That was created to mobilize Europeans on the basis of an identity that brings them together. Why did and that whole process of war, because of ethnicity, because of religion, really destroyed the cultural fabric that connected people in the past. So they had a reason. They had a reason to say that, look, we need to stay away from religion. We need to stay away from indigenous cultures and politics. We need to create a new enlightenment where we create a democratic structure and system. And that is how they created pluralism, to allow different perspectives to exist together. We need to create it by law, because the practice and law of our religion, our past, didn't allow us to live together. But come to Ethiopia, how did these different tribes, different religions live together? Because the people themselves were unconsciously pluralist. Unconscious pluralism is a pluralism that accepts difference as important. Indigenous cultures in most parts of the world, including Ethiopia, were unconsciously pluralist. Here in Australia, when Europeans came, initially, they were seen as coming from some kind of spiritual place. People are not necessarily there to oppose difference. When Columbus and others were going to Latin America, and the indigenous people there saw them as maybe ancestors coming from the past. Yeah. So, indigenous cultures were not necessarily against difference. So Ethiopians were able to live together as Oromos, as Tigrins, as Gurages, different tribes together, without really questioning, without politicizing that identity. So it is very important for Ethiopians to remember that when politics inserts itself into our culture, into our religion, the enemy, the political enemy, will be an enemy that is there to be destroyed without us doing anything. So this is a political strategy that shows our failure to honor and respect our ancestors, our traditional culture, and even using that traditional culture in a negative way.
Yeah. And I think every time we think about, the issues in Ethiopia, especially the young, that when we've been educated in the West, especially, there's a sense of trying to compare ourselves with either African Americans here or other indigenous communities within America, if I'm speaking, within the framework of the United States. And something that we tend to want to do is draw a comparison between, the slavery that happened or the indigenous people that were, kicked off their land. And we draw a comparison of that and take it to Ethiopia and see this is how we lived. This is oppression that we dealt with, and this is what it continues to do. And what we forget is, like you said, I love how you said there was a unconscious pluralism being practiced, because one thing we don't see in the United States, but is very alive and present in Ethiopia, is this intermarriage, right? We might have our stereotypes, but we did marry whoever within the borders of Ethiopia. And we see that because few people, if any, could trace back and say, I am purely Amhara or I am purely Oromo. Whereas we see in the United States, that was outlawed, right? If you're a Black person, you cannot marry a white person. If you're a Black person, you cannot vote. There were actively rules that were set in place to marginalize people. And there's always this need to compare ourselves, I guess, to further explain our oppression as people by another using these kind of frameworks. And also to add to that, I guess, for what you said, if, for example, the TPLF or LA, when they started their organization, when they made the Amhara the enemy of their people, right? It wasn't a secret, right? This is something that they wrote in their manifesto from day one. They had it in place for 10 years, 15 years before it became legal. Legally implemented, at least. And it started from the elite and it trickled down to the people. So when all this was happening, where was the Amhara elite, or where was the Ethiopian center in response to what is happening, and understanding of our culture? What happened there? Who dropped the ball?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You see, we have to remember also, why are these people doing this? These are people who have, these elites who divide our people on the basis of ethnicism. They themselves come from mixed families. Some of them are married with another ethnic group. And why does our politics allow the demonization of innocent people? Especially if you look at recent period violence against Amharas living in Oromia. They are displaced from their homes. They are killed. And a lot of the victims are rural farming people, farmers. Who have no knowledge of politics at all. And I think we have to understand the reason very, very well, because, as I showed in my book, Native Colonialism was there to accumulate power for the colonizers. So the central question is, how do we gain power, and how do we gain and amass resources from others? And in order to do that, the colonizers often divided the people on the basis of their ethnicity, so that the people become incapable of utilizing their resources, incapable of or unable to cooperate, work together to develop their life. That is how colonial authorities can accumulate significant wealth, exploit natural resources, take land from the poor people and use it for foreigners, export to the colonial countries, but allow their own people to starve. Because when you demonize a people, when you make people engage in politics on the basis of their identity and ethnicity, they become incapable of articulating their economic needs. They become unable to cooperate together and make the politics work for them. So this is a struggle to rob people of their life. So it is really important. There are these two ideologies that emerged when the TPLF came to power. In order to accumulate its own power base within Tigray, it invented Tigray as separate and distinct from others, especially from Amhara. This is that Tigray and Amhara are very interlinked people. For centuries, they lived together. Even the language of Giz, the history that they have is something impossible even to imagine to separate. Yeah. But how do you separate them? Use their language and invent a false narrative which says that the Amharas were rulers over the Tigrayans, or the Amhara ruling class were the class that oppressed the Tigrayans. But if we go back to history, look at Emperor Yohannes, for instance, who was from Tigray, but who died fighting for the whole of Ethiopia, fighting against the Derbush, the Egyptians. He died in Metemma, trying to protect Gondar from the invasion of
Sudan.
the Mahdists. And you find all of these people really looking at themselves as one Ethiopia. But this ethnic group, political group, in order to have its own power base, it has always to make sure that there is a border between Tigrayans and other identities. Mm-hmm. That is why until today, the first objective of these political entities seems to be that they continuously perpetuate the border or the difference between their ethnic base and other groups. Yeah. So the first thesis for 27 years when TPLF was in power focused on presenting Amharas as ethnic dominators, as ethnic oppressors of Tigray and other regions. Now, after 27 years of this type of politics, our people still remain intact, and the recent war happened, and Abiy Ahmed came to power. And when the Oromo-based nationalist movement started to become strong, it even radicalized what was started by the TPLF by demonizing, presenting the Amhara not just as an ethnic oppressor, but also as a political entity that was a colonizer. When you present a people as colonizer, it allows you to demonize them as colonizers, because decolonization allows you to take violence. And I think there's some kind of video we can see how this type of ideology can make people say in mobilizing themselves to attack innocent people.
Yoo isaan finfinneen karaa cufani nuti warra jalatti gadafe mana itti cufnee itti gubuu qabna. Karaan finfinnee yoo cufame nageellee Arsii keessaa manzeen gara cufattu hin qabdu. Dhumuu qabdi. Baduu qabdi, nu keessaa bahuu qabdi. Biyya keenya keessaa diinni bahuu qaba. Nu keessa uummanni Oromoo ka diina gargaarullee yoo jiraate har'a isa waa godhuu hin dandeenyu. Garaa keessatti gad ukkaamsanne arra garaa keessatti qabanne diina qabne of keessa baafne kan walitti garagaluu qabna malee arra ija nama kenna gumaa nama kenna osoo hin baafne walitti garagallee walaaleffachuu hin qabnu. Kanaaf qeerroo biyya keessaatiin kan dhaamu yoo isaan karaa gadii cufan karaa gadii itti cufaati tokkochaaf lama miti dhibbaan du'uu qabdi abashoonni. Haacaaluu yoo isaan finfinneen karaa cufani nuti warra jalatti gadafe mana itti cufnee itti gubuu qabna.
I think that is the end of it. And I believe this was a speech that became really famous when Haacaaluu Hundeessaa passed away, I believe in 2020. Could you tell us what she was saying on this speech and how that's been weaponized against the Amhara people?
Yeah, I can only see the translation, and I'm not fluent in Oromifa, but what it says is we have to lock their houses and burn them. If they block roads to Addis, burn in Negeli Arsi, have no place to go, they have to be finished. Block the roads and not 1, 2, but in hundreds, Habesha must die. And if you see this is a clear example of inciting genocide. And this is live broadcasted on social media so that ordinary Oromos can hear it and attack innocent people, innocent Amharas. And this happened is we have to take this very seriously, because what happened was a famous Oromo artist, Haacaaluu Hundeessaa, was assassinated in Addis Ababa. And this unfortunate and tragic incident was used to incite violence against poor, innocent people across Oromia. And these media networks broadcasted ordinary people saying this, to close roads, to block roads so that innocent Amharas should be killed, should be burned alive. And this type of little incidents triggering murder has not been presented, has not been known in the world. And I suspect these videos are still available online because nobody cares in that context about Amharas who are being killed. So that is why we should really connect this with the political structure, with the political system that is being created in the country, allowing innocent people to be killed. And there might be more videos we can hear, we can listen to.
Yeah. So I think these are the same ideas of the idea of exterminating the Amhara people. And these are speeches that are being made in Ethiopia. These are not speeches from abroad, although we do also see speeches as such coming out of the diaspora as well. So if this is a narrative issue, right, if this started from a misinterpretation of the history of Ethiopia or a misunderstanding of the cultures of Ethiopia, most of us, including myself, would think the way to fix this problem would be to, speak truth to power in a sense of, fix the wrong or the false narratives that we have out there. But you argue that's not the fundamental issue of the Amhara people right now. Why do you say that? And what is the fundamental issue of the Amhara people right now?
Yes, yes, that's a very good point, because a lot of people think, oh, this is just a misunderstanding. People are misled to believe in a certain way. But we have to see what is happening. We have to see what is the politics looking like. What are the political elites doing? In many places where the Amharas are massacred and killed, there are political elites which are manufacturing false narratives by reversing the narrative, by saying that it's actually the Amharas which are perpetuating violence against the Oromos. And, we have to remember that Amharas were not allowed in Ethiopia to be organized based on their own interests. For the last 30 years, 27 years during TPLF, and recently under the Oromo Prosperity Party, the Amharas were not allowed to form their own independent or sovereign political entity. They were ruled indirectly by political groups created by their own oppressors, by people who accepted this narrative that the Amharas must be dominated. So because of that, the Amharas never had a chance to present their ideas politically. Even recently, when few Amharas who are in the government, in the legislature, in the parliament, were trying to speak for the Amhara voices, they are arrested, disregarding their parliamentarian immunity. Yeah. So what does this tell you? It clearly shows you that there is no political space for Amharas. They're not allowed to engage politically in Ethiopia. Yeah. And there is also another problem. You see, when you say Amhara, the political system in Ethiopia designates anyone they don't like politically as Amhara. Yeah. It's not just the poor Amhara farmer, but also the people who believe in Ethiopian unity by disregarding diversity, and also any political entity that opposes existing hegemonic ethno-nationalist ideology that portrays Amhara as oppressor and enemy. Anyone who opposes this is regarded as Amhara. In some instances, even the prime minister in some months ago or some years ago was designated as Amhara when these politicians view him not accepting this dominant ideology who say that Amhara are oppressors and enemy. When he was not saying that openly, they called him Amhara. And there are publications which mentioned him or designated him as an Amhara by citing his connection with his mother, his Amhara mother, as they wrote it. So I'm not saying this, I'm not comfortable talking about this, all of this, but this is what the literature is saying. The Ethiopian political system created a condition by which no Amhara voices can be heard. Now, if you come internationally and globally, people who tried to write on this point, including myself, when we tried to submit articles to New York Times, to Foreign Policy, our articles were rejected repeatedly because, it doesn't seem to go with the dominant narrative. And there is a total misunderstanding that Amharas do not have any political power, any political position in Ethiopia. And anyone which claims to represent Amhara is someone who has accepted the thesis that Amhara must be dominated because they were oppressors or dominators in the past. So that is a reality. So in the face of all of this, and when the war between TPLF and the government happened, and following all of that, the Amhara become vulnerable, and they don't have any other way to protect themselves. And recently, the government, after going through all that violence with the TPLF and all that outcry that happened in Tigray because of human rights violations, all of that is left unaddressed. And there is now a coalition, a deal, a peace, they call it a peace deal between the government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And there seems to be another criminalization of Amhara, scapegoating the genocide, the war, or whatever is being said in Tigray, scapegoating it as if it is something caused by the Amhara. So that it is because it is convenient for the leaders to come together, impress each other as peacemakers, and pointing fingers at these vulnerable people whom they dominated for more than 30 years now. And they want them to disarm. They want them not to hold weapons in the country. They want them to be vulnerable so that they can be attacked, so that their land can be taken. Now, the resistance within Amhara is, look, you denied us for more than 30 years any political space. Yeah. You denied us voices by presenting puppets that you created in our name. You denied us international voices writing false narrative that you are victims when in fact you are the ones who are victimizing us. What do we do in the end? Now you come to take everything that we have, to take weapons from our traditional warriors and young people. And this is the only way we can survive. So that is why people are supporting the resistance in Amhara, because there is no political system at all. Yeah. And the only remained voice, which was in parliament, is also closed. And people are being, jailed in masses. So people should really understand what is happening in Ethiopia, because it is a fight, it is a resistance for remaining human. It is not. It's not something that should be seen only through political ideology. It is actually something that should be addressed, and there must be steps taken to address it.
Yeah. So just to kind of really reiterate what's going on within the Amhara region right now, as we know, in case you didn't know as well, there is a full-on war that's happening between the Amhara forces and what they're calling themselves Fano, and the government of Ethiopia, who is saying there's a coup d'etat attempt at my legal rights, right? So what exactly is the Amhara people asking, and who is representing them? Do they have a leader that is speaking for them?
Yeah, the first point is to remember that whatever involvement Amharas had in the war with Tigray is the responsibility of the Ethiopian government. They were the people who were recruited or who may have participated in that war. to the level where the land that of Amhara was taken by Tigray when the Tigrayans were in power, and those contested territories. And also the grievances in the past, how the Tigrayans for 27 years were oppressing Amharas. All of these narratives was used by the government to mobilize Amhara forces and participate in the war. And there is a clear difference between the role of Amhara participation in Tigray war versus the role of the government. And we have to remember that that war was a fight between the central government, which bring many forces from different ethnic groups, not just from Amhara, from others as well. And they went to war against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which in the process caused significant human rights violations in Tigray. And also in Amhara and Afar as well, when the TPLF invaded these places. Now, we have to remember that this was not Amharas going to invade these places. There are these ideologues, this group of people who were in power, who had privilege in Ethiopia in the past, and have created their intellectual reputation based on their association with TPLF. And they are misguiding the world by projecting the Amhara as part of a government deciding to go and fight or invade Tigrayans. That is not the case. You know, Amharas do not have political representation on the basis of their own demands. And also a lot of Amharas were not, you know, they don't even know the war was happening. And people blame Amharas or Oromos or Tigrayans as people part of this problem. But look, the whole entire population of Ethiopia, about 16 or 17% of the people only have internet accesses. They don't even understand what's happening in the country. More than 80% of the people live in rural places. In this context, we cannot see that. We cannot say that people as people were participants of this violence. This was a violence that tries to create, that try to involve civilians by and was instigated by political elites. Now, having said that, what is being done or what is being said in Amhara region or across the Amhara is that they no longer have a representation in the country because their own representatives imposed through the system are not speaking for them. Yeah. There was a last regional parliament meeting of the Amharas in Bahir Dar recently before all this violence happened. What they did was, in order to stifle, in order to not allow the people to know what is happening, they shut down, they make the parliamentary meeting in secret so that nobody can be heard about, and they were not really addressing the grievances, because before that, Amharas were not allowed to go even into the capital. You know, many people's houses, Amhara's people's houses were demolished along with other people. So all of this coming together make it clear for most people in Ethiopia, for Amharas, that they have to resist the system in order to survive.
So I guess two questions follow up on that. Is there a precedent in which a region's representatives could have or should have a meeting in secret? And are there series of questions that people brought up to the representatives that the representatives were not willing to address?
Yes. Firstly, these people represent their own people. And often the practice, even in Ethiopia, where that, the debate in parliament is heard by all the people that watch that debate. And that's what happens in federal parliament and also in other regional governments. Because the Amhara regional government was set up by the center and the political system, not by the Amhara people themselves. They stifled the voice of the people. They are there to use the Amhara people as instruments of the political system, which demonizes the Amhara themselves. So because of that, there is a swell of significant questions that comes from the public. Yeah. But they instead held the meeting in secret. So, and also propagate ideas that are contrary to what the people were asking. And that clearly proves that they're not there for the best interest of the people, you know. And I forgot the second question that you asked.
Yeah, I was saying, what there are a list of questions that people brought forth to the representatives?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the people were simply saying this: look, we should not be killed. There are hundreds of thousands of people that are displaced forcefully through violence from Oromia, from Benshangul Gums and other regions, and are living on the streets. Yeah. And that's the lives of these people is not considered as a political question, and their representatives are not trying to address it. When Amharas are going to the capital Addis Ababa for medication or for whatever reason, they are stopped on the way, are not allowed to enter into the capital. And their representatives were not addressing that question. And the most damaging and the most sad reality is also the reality faced by Amhara farmers. There was no enough fertilizer. There is no fertilizer available or made available for Amhara farmers. I understand there might be shortages in different parts of the country, but the Amharas were significantly affected. And these poor farmers came from rural areas trying to ask their government to find a way to get fertilizers, because without fertilizers, they cannot grow crops. If they don't farm their land right now, that will be another form of genocide in the years to come, because they will not have anything to feed their family. And the government did not make that a priority. We hear the government saying they have surplus production of wheat and they are exporting it to overseas countries. But the Amharas are dying of starvation, as in other parts of the country as well. And this clearly shows that the government is not there for the people, but to make prosperity and money for the few who are in power. And this was very clear. And the people want these questions to be addressed. And instead of voicing these questions, the government came up with a plan of creating a state of emergency, sending the military to the Amhara people. You know, according to the Ethiopian constitution, there is a level of sovereignty. Remember, the Tigray war happened when the government was, the Tigrayans were trying to say that the government should not come to our region. So what is happening here is in the Amhara region, the people are asking legitimate questions, but instead the government sent in the army. And the army that is accused of so many atrocities in Tigray. And within this context, where the Amhara are not represented or are also demonized for old monarchical past, they have to resist, and because that is the only way that they have to survive as human beings.
Yeah. I guess I want to know what, like, for people that are watching also that might have the same question, what is the difference between, for example, you brought up that, you know, there are people that were starving, there were people that are being displaced from their living, but that wasn't necessarily uniquely an Amhara situation, right? We've seen that happen to Tigrayans, we've seen that happen in Afar, we've seen that happen in Somalia, where they had one of the worst droughts a few months ago. We've seen that in Gurage regions. It seems like it's widespread. What makes the situation in Amhara region unique to a point where people felt the only way for us to continue to exist in this country is to resist what's happening?
That is a very important question, and I think people should really understand this. All Ethiopians are affected by what's going on in the country. Oromos are suffering, ordinary Oromos, for a long time, in particular in some places in Wallagga and other areas. It is not ordinary Oromos standing up and trying to destroy Amharas. There are individual civilians who are agitating violence, as we saw in that video, but the majority of Oromos, I don't believe the majority of Oromos necessarily want to destroy or kill Amharas. They want to live peacefully with their brothers and sisters, as they did live with them for a long period of time in the past. But the Amhara people, the Oromo people, the Tigray people, as a people, want to live peacefully. But they are suffering as victims, or some of them being, invented as to become perpetrators by selling to them, by imposing on them false narratives about an Amhara being their enemy. So I want to make it clear that this is a struggle for the survival of all Ethiopians, ordinary Ethiopians, who want to have their families, to have bread and education and a future. But the political system in the country created an enemy by selecting one ethnic group as the enemy of all other ethnic groups. That is what makes the Amhara unique. There is no any other ethnic group in the constitution or on the base of the constitution that is invented as linked with the monarchical system as a colonizer. If you look at the colonial thesis, which is invented by some ideologues or individuals who try to create a very radical version of Oromo nationalism. Mm-hmm. What they say is, these poor people who are living in Oromia, who are peacefully living with their brothers and sisters there, they project them as colonial settlers. Yeah. Why do they do that? They do that because if these people are seen as colonial settlers, colonialism allows decolonization. Colonialism allows you to take land from the colonizer. Mm-hmm. Colonialism allows you to be violent to a colonizer. So by falsely inventing these poor Amharas as the colonizers of Oromos, they try to tell ordinary Oromos, especially the young ones which do not have much experience in the past, they want them to believe that these poor, innocent people who live with them are their enemies. Yeah. So what it means is that this political system creates or makes ordinary and innocent Oromos to have a criminal identity by participating in a criminal act that perpetuates violence on the Amharas. So it is not just the Amharas, the victims, which are harmed. It is also the perpetrators, the killers, which become killers. That become their identity. But they are made not to see themselves as killers, because they are made to see the Amharas through the false ideology given to them by politicians. That is what we mean. That is what is very sad. And we should remember is ideology of this kind make you see your victims not as human. Remember, why did ordinary Hutus, which are just people who have families, why did they kill not just Tutsis, but other Hutus who are sympathetic to Tutsis? Yeah. Because in their vision, in their ideology, they believed truly that the Tutsis were not human, that they are their national enemy, the enemy of the Hutu nation. Once you believe that Amharas are the enemy of the Oromo nation, even Oromos, which raise human voices, will be seen as enemies. Why? Because the way you express your love for your nation is by showing your hate and cruelty to its enemy. The more you become violent towards the enemy of your nation, the more patriotic you become. Mm-hmm. That is the demonizing formula of nationalism, which makes both the killers and the victims subhuman. But we focus on the Amhara, not because the Amhara are the only victims. As I say, Oromos also, Tigrayans, and others are harmed in this process. But the Amharas are the only ones which are invented as outsiders in order to create a new Ethiopia. And I want to add one very important point for diasporas, for anyone who know about Ethiopia. what is being attacked as Amhara is the indigenous Ethiopia that kept the independence of the country, that brought this literature that fought and defeated Italian colonialism, that Ethiopia for whom Rastafarians, were singing and celebrating, that Ethiopia from whom all Black people felt proud because this was a country that was never colonized. Remember how all Africans adopted the Ethiopian red, yellow, and green, red, and yellow flag. All that Ethiopia is reinvented, casted as an Amhara identity. The Tigrayans fought in the Adwa, Oromos fought in Adwa. The flag belonged to all of us. And the ideology at that time was a belief based on the king. Remember, Emperor Menelik or Haile Selassie came from mixed families, from Oromos, and their family were intermarried with Tigrayans and others. You see? So in order to destroy this indigenous Ethiopia, in order to destroy its indigenous Orthodox Tawahedo phase, a phase, the only Christian phase in the world, which accepted other phases as brothers and sisters. It never happened by Catholics in Europe or Protestants in Europe, because they never accepted other religions as equal or as friendly, if not equal. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church is the only church in the world, an indigenous church, not imported from Europe, but indigenously grew from within. And remember, one of the most prominent patriarch, leader of the Orthodox Church was not Amhara, Abuna Petros. Yeah. So all of this shows us that this precious Ethiopia, known by the world as the pride of Black people, this Ethiopia is being destroyed as Amhara. They first criminalized Amhara through a long period of marginalization and making Amharas not to have any voices. Now they put all Ethiopian history, including Adwa, including its independence, including its unique culture, including its resistance to imperialism or colonialism, as an Amhara identity so that it can be destroyed. So all Ethiopians should know this. If you keep quiet and silent to what is happening in Ethiopia, we are simply allowing not just innocent Amharas to be murdered, but also an entire Ethiopian identity that was built by the bloods and sacrifice of our forefathers and mothers to be destroyed. That is what is at stake in Ethiopia. And that is why I decided to speak out.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who has joined us. I want to thank Ainalam Dagu for becoming a member of Adebabay Media. For those of you that are not yet members of this media, you could go ahead and join and be part of this community along with us. This program really, Dr. Yurga, what I wanted to do with this specific segment is truly understand what's happening in Ethiopia and specifically in the Amhara region before we even start talk about solutions and different ideas that might be out there. So to just kind of wrap up today's program, and we'll come back to the solutions in part 2 next week. Part of your native colonialism is that, if, for example, if I'm seeing it as an outsider, right, the language of Ethiopia is Amharic, right? The religion of Ethiopia used to be for hundreds, if not thousands of years, was the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Christianity or the Orthodox Church. If we look at culture, right, as an outsider, if I say, oh, that's Ethiopian, and something that I recognize as Ethiopian culture is cultures that would come from the western part of Ethiopia, right, from the Amhara and Tigray regions. So if I'm looking at all that, what right do I have to say there has not been an oppressor within the Ethiopian culture? And that would be my last question.
That is a very good point. And I think I have to really emphasize the relationship between culture and political power. And that is very key. You see, right now, the government is using Amharic as a national language. Are Amharas oppressing other ethnic groups now? Right now, when TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, excluding the Amharas from political power, and reinventing Amhara identity as an oppressor, they were using the Amharic language. Is Amhara people, the poor people, oppressors or dominant? Everyone can go to Al Jazeera report about the Amhara people. That report on YouTube, you can find it. It says the Amhara people are the poorest, not just in Ethiopia, but all over the world. The Amhara are the poorest people all over the world at the moment. Yes, the government is using the Amharic language. Yes, they speak in Amharic and in other languages as well, but the Amhara people are criminalized and are excluded from political power. So what we should see is the connection between political power and culture. The language does not necessarily serve their own people. And let's go back in history as well. As I said earlier, during the colonial period, during the monarchical period, the ideology of the monarchy was not based on ethnicism.
Yeah.
You see, it is not based on ethnicism because when the Tigrayans were ruling Ethiopia as emperors of Ethiopia, Emperor Johannes, for instance, he was using the Amharic language as a language of the empire. Because the people participate in the empire not to support or to pay tribute to the Amhara clan or tribe. There was no such thing as a clan or a tribe that is oppressing others. But what they were doing is they were participating in a politics that sees the empire, the monarchy, as embracing all of them. That is why within Oromo, who were the people participating in expanding the reach of the rule of the king, like Menelik, Oromos were the ones who were doing that. The Oromos participated during the Zamana Masafins, the Yeju Oromos were part of the Ethiopian monarchical system. They had power. Were they serving Amharas at that time? You see, this is a false invention. In order to destroy Ethiopia's history, Ethiopia's indigenous Christianity, you have to demonize it as a religion of a colonizer, an evil entity.
Yeah.
So if we go back in history, yes, there was a time when we used the Amharic language, but also remember this. Before even the 1960s, go and look at the World Bank statistics. 90% of Ethiopians were rural farmers. Right now as well, more than 80% of Ethiopians are rural farmers. How do these rural people who are farmers, who are poor farmers, participating in colonizing others in the same way Europeans did in the past? When Europeans created colonialism in other countries, what did they do? They take away their farmers from their lands, in a process called the destruction of the commons, So what they did was they removed the farmers or the tenants and they settled them in North America, in South America, in all colonized peoples. They had plenty of people to send them to be colonizers into other people. In our case, was there such a history where a government tried to destroy other ethnic groups by making them superior to others who were participants in that colonial expansion of Europe? Large Europeans. Within Ethiopia, the troops of the kings and the emperors came from anywhere. They came from every ethnic group. They were intermarried. So we have to remember, Ethiopians did not have an ethnic class structure that is created to oppress others. And this is also the case in the rest of Africa. Anyone can read research done by Mahmoud Mahmoudani on Sudan, for instance, or on Rwanda and others. What he found out is that before colonialism, there were tribes, there were ethnic groups in Africa, but they were not nations. What is a nation? A nation is an entity that views itself politically organized by separating its enemy from its own identity. There was no Amhara nation, Tigray nation, Oromo nation in the old imperial period. There was this ideology of monarchy that supports the king as anointed by God and embracing everyone. But to invent nationalism, to give it a long history in the past, what did politicians do? They created false narratives. They create new culture. They create new symbols, new flags, and then they make their own people believe through education, through political propaganda, through writing, to make them believe that they were really nations from right the beginning in the olden past, but they did not have political power because this other ethnic group dominated them. This is how they did it. And we have to again and again remember that in order to bring change in Ethiopia, there is no complicated problem. It is complicated only when we try to think through the reasoning, through the construct, through the ideologies of the elites. Just think through the eyes of people who are being killed. What makes us human is when we see what's happening through the eyes, the experiences of people who are victims. And I'm not calling anyone to become political in this way or another. What I think we may say, I might say a few words about this later on. What I think the solution is something that allows us, all of us, to participate. Just to add one point to native colonialism, this is what native colonialism is. I wish I can rewrite my book now because I have much significant evidence to show the evil faces of native colonialism. How native leaders use false narrative of history, use ideology to reinvent the past, to recreate their own, the identity of people as enemies and friends in order to rob their own people of their past, present, and future. When Ethiopians, who are Oromos, who are Tigray, who are Amhara, who are Afar, Somali, Gurage, anywhere, when Ethiopians start to imagine that their past was actually a past where they were dominated by Amharas, what are we doing? They are destroying their history. We are robbing them of the heritage that they have from the past. When they say, we tell them, where they become nations, they become powerful by fighting their enemy, by creating their own system, what are we making them? We are making them to imagine the present of these developed nations as their possible future.
Yeah.
So they lose their past, their history, and they also lose their future because they participate in a political system that robs everything that they have in the past and in the future. So what is at stake is everyone's identity, because through politics, we create our identity.
Yeah.
As an Oromo, or Amhara, or an Afar, or Ethiopian, whatever, we create our political identity based on what we think and do, not based on what other people say. So we are made to be reinvented as new people with an identity full of grievance, identity full of rage, identity that make us see our friends as enemies and go out and participate in killing them. And that is why it is not just for the Amharas or for that, it is something that involves all of us because it affects all of us personally.
Thank you so much. This is, I think, a perfect place to stop our discussion for today. And again, like I said, this is a way for us to really understand what's going on within Ethiopia in the larger scope, but then within the Amhara region specifically, and to the Amhara people within the framework of the Ethiopian history. We will pick up how this identity is being shaped to help create a new Ethiopia and what the solutions could be as far as what each of us could do and what we can ask our government of. Thank you so much for everyone that joined us in this discussion. I've tried to read as much as possible your comments and try to bring those questions to Dr. Yergo. And Dr. Yergo, thank you for being here with us. We'll pick up this discussion next week as part 2 of what are the possible solutions for this. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.